The movie begins with a man named Paul, who is a property agent, and he now wants to sell a house to someone who will come to that house. Paul is an ambitious man, and he has ambitions to become the best property agent by successfully selling houses or even factories. So he thinks he must look impressive in front of people who want to buy property, and the property he sells must look clean and not sticky. As a result, the likelihood of his sales success becomes greater, and finally, he becomes the #1 property agent in his current office. When with his colleague named Jack, Paul hopes that he can experience true wealth for himself if his sales results continue to succeed, so he could buy an impressive sports car that he has dreamed of all this time. At home, Paul already has a family with his wife, named Grace, and they already have 2 children who are teenagers. One day, Grace receives a call from the hospital, saying that her uncle has passed away, which of course makes Grace sad because Grace no longer has parents, and the uncle has been like a father to Grace. This makes her remember the necklace given by the uncle that is broken. So after remembering the times with the uncle, Paul and Grace go to the lawyer to arrange the inheritance from the uncle. While waiting for someone to come, Paul remembers that the uncle was a generous person and he even helped them by funding the entire cost of their wedding. Not long after that, the person they were waiting for comes to the room, who is a pastor from Paul and Grace's church, who will be a witness before the lawyer starts reading the will from the uncle. He says that he bequeaths around $50,000 to his younger sibling who lives in a village and trusts Paul to sell his personal house. But the sales proceeds, including the commission, will be given to a children's orphanage in his sibling's village. This makes Paul momentarily shocked, guessing that he would get an inheritance like money. But his shock is not over yet, because it turns out the uncle bequeaths a simple plant pot. Not only that, there's a sentence from the uncle about this plant pot, which is, when you know the truth, you will be free. As a result, Paul becomes confused about the inheritance given by the uncle. So Paul wants to throw away the plant pot, but is interrupted by the arrival of the pastor. This makes Paul feel annoyed about having to receive a plant pot, so he and Grace become somewhat tense. And finally, Paul has no choice but to accept the presence of the plant pot. Paul and Jack then go to a coffee shop, where they discuss the future development of property. And Jack thinks that in the future, the property business will remain stable, but will not rise significantly. He feels that Paul cannot truly become rich, even though his sales are smooth. This makes him keep thinking about Jack's words, to the point that Paul does not want to give charity to a poor man, but not to Jack, who wants to give charity. Because he wants to get extra profit, Paul desires to work together with Jack on a factory that he wants to sell, until finally he agrees to that cooperation with a 50-50 profit sharing. Because winter is coming soon, Paul goes home to tidy up the items in the backyard and puts the plant pot in the warehouse to be taken care of, according to Grace's uncle's wish to take care of his plant pot. And not long after that, Paul realizes something impressive, which turns out to be that several paper bills are growing among the leaves. So Paul pulls them out, and finally he feels disbelief that the money is real. Not long after that, his 2 children came. Paul immediately hides all that money and feels afraid to tell about that impressive plant pot, even to the point of admitting he cannot join a family event, so that he has more time to handle the plant pot secretly. After making sure the plant pot still looks safe, Paul goes to see the factory that Jack wants to sell. And after they work together to ensure the situation and condition of the factory are still fine, Paul immediately returns to take care of that impressive plant pot, and guesses that the arrival of the large amount of money owned by the uncle is from this money plant pot. But Paul does not know clearly how the money can grow. After several days of taking care of that plant, he expects that the money has grown again, so he goes to check the plant pot, and several bills really grow again. As a result, Paul becomes smiling, and after several days of taking care of and taking the money from the plant, he finally appears more impressive than usual. This makes people he knows amazed to see Paul's new appearance. It makes his colleague momentarily shocked when Paul pays the debts that he has not paid before, as well as his wife becomes amazed when she sees Paul's new appearance, especially since he already has an expensive watch. So Grace asks how much money has been spent, which of course is not told the truth by Paul. Therefore, he lies about the reason for the profit from his work. Because his backyard is messy, filled with leaves, Paul goes to a store to buy a cleaning vehicle, which can overcome the problem in his backyard. Previously, Paul wanted to inform Grace about this purchase, but then decided not to, and finally, Paul immediately made the transaction with the paper bills that he had collected. After some time waiting at home, finally the cleaning vehicle also arrives. So the courier brother is momentarily amazed by the cleaning vehicle, because that vehicle is known to be expensive and impressive for the residents around city. When he is happily doing the cleaning, Grace comes and starts to wonder about Paul's purchase of a cleaning vehicle because Grace just found out that Paul already has more money than usual, so Grace asks where Paul got that much money. Again, Paul lies with the same reason, but his reason makes Grace annoyed, thinking Paul has wasted money on something that could still be handled by hand. However, her annoyance has not been able to stop Paul's greed. He returns to the plant pot to take more money, until finally the money is collected, reaching almost $100,000. After making sure that he has not been caught at all, he lies on the bed with the money, and finally, he experiences the highest point in his life. This success is then channeled by approaching his dream car, then doing an approach first, and finally, he expresses his true feelings to the dream car. After knowing the car's price, Paul says that he wants to pay directly with paper money in a suitcase, which shocks the salesperson, because usually people pay without using paper money. But because he wants to make a profit, the salesperson agrees by asking for Paul's personal data as one of the requirements for the car transaction. When Paul is happily showing off his impressive car to Jack, he does not realize that it turns out there is a detective who knows about his car transaction from a bank that suspects Paul of having a lot of money in his suitcase. So to be more certain that the money he got is not money from illegal actions, the detective starts to find out the activities done by Paul secretly. Meanwhile, Paul finally shows off the impressive car to his family, where his two children are shocked by the car bought by their father, but not for Grace, who is actually getting more annoyed with what Paul is doing, and finally, the flowers given by him are rejected. To calm down her annoyance, Paul talks alone with Grace about buying that car, and after Grace knows the car's price, she asks again where Paul got that much money. He still answers it with a lie until Grace admits that she already has difficulty trusting Paul again, and finally, he is told to sleep in the living room first. This makes his two children suspicious of their parents' relationship, because they like to fight lately, guessing that they want a divorce, but Grace finds it difficult to explain her annoyance toward Paul. One day, after Paul leaves for work, Grace receives a surprising guest, who turns out to be the detective, and he wants to ask about the expenses made by Paul. But after answering several questions from the detective, Grace becomes shocked when the detective says that Paul had a suitcase containing a lot of money. So, because she does not want her husband to get into trouble, Grace asks the detective to come again if Paul is already at home, but with the intention of politely dismissing the detective. After Paul comes home from work, the detective monitors Paul from afar while listening to his assistant speak, who states that Paul has never committed any violations from his criminal record, which makes the detective more curious about Paul. As soon as he checks the plant pot, Grace comes and tells him that there's a detective who came to look for him, but Paul admits it is difficult to tell the truth. Grace then asks whether Paul is not happy with what they have now, because they already have a quite nice house, delicious food on the table, and two cute children. As a result, Paul feels pressured, so he wants to talk about that plant pot to the pastor and not to his own wife. But before that, Paul donates a lot of money to their church, before telling why Paul really likes having a lot of money instantly. He reveals that his parents used to worry about money problems. Paul does not want to be like that again when he has a family, and considers Grace's uncle a figure who motivates him to become rich. Hearing this, the pastor advises Paul with something that can make him calmer, until finally his heart is moved, and he starts to question why Grace's uncle gave that magical plant pot, because he realizes that the money from that plant has slowly ruined his life. One day, after buying coffee at the usual place, Paul starts to feel moved in his heart to share money with the poor man. But the money is not small, rather the money is quite a lot that Paul gives. As soon as Paul leaves, it turns out there is a detective who is still spying on Paul and suspects the poor man of being a drug dealer secretly, as well as just sold it to Paul at a cost that is not small. Even though the poor man has given an honest statement, the detective still does not believe, and finally, he brings the poor man to the police station. After the detective comes to the house again to ask where Paul is, Grace feels more worried about the problem faced by Paul. So Grace calls Paul, but he does not answer at all. Therefore, Grace calls his office, and the staff there tells her that Paul is together with Jack at the factory. So Grace goes there accompanied by her daughter. The missed call from Grace is then noticed by Paul, and he does not hear the calls from Grace and his child when they arrive, because Paul is in a different area of the factory, and he is focused on telling the truth about that plant pot to Jack. A few moments later, while continuously shouting for Paul on the second floor, the daughter does not know that there's a broken barrier fence. Therefore, she falls from the second floor after she holds that fence, and finally, she gets injured. Their screams are then heard by Jack, but not by Paul, So they go to check that scream, and finally Paul becomes shocked when he realizes his child has fallen from the second floor. As a result, Paul and Grace become anxious about their child's condition because the doctor has said that the daughter's head hit the floor when she fell, to the point of making Paul and Jack tense with each other by blaming themselves. Grace then asks why the barrier fence could be broken in that factory, to which Paul reveals that previously Jack wanted to fix that fence, but Paul told him not to because he thinks that fence can just be covered with a cloth. As a result, Grace becomes angrier with what Paul has done, which finally makes him devastated. So he prays to the Almighty to give Paul a chance to change and make everything return to normal again. Sometime later, the daughter regains consciousness from her head treatment, and finally, Paul and his family become relieved. But there is still business that Paul must handle, which is dealing with the police about the allegation that the money he received is illegal. He goes to the police station to be detained temporarily until the police get to the truth. Not long after that, he hears an unfamiliar voice, which turns out to be the pastor who also enters jail because he has received a lot of money, suspected to be illegal, from Paul. The pastor then talks about that plant pot and asks whether Paul will remain greedy if he does not have a plant pot, to which Paul responds that the pastor apparently knows about the miracle of the plant pot all this time. This is confirmed by the pastor, and he admits he once gave that plant pot to Grace's uncle in the past, as well as thinks that the plant only appears and helps people who need to change their bad nature to become good. He adds that he once saw that when the uncle had a lot of money, but he was actually not happy, until he thinks that he can help people who need it by donating some of his money. And finally, he finds his life's purpose, which makes him able to feel happiness. Paul is then surprised by someone else, who turns out to be the poor man. So Paul feels guilty for sending the poor man to jail too. However, the pastor reminds Paul of the message conveyed by the uncle when bequeathing that plant pot, until finally Paul feels certain that he already knows the truth, and that truth is he must change. Meanwhile, the detective continues to investigate the allegation of Paul's illegal money. But after the detective hears the statement from Jack, who knows about that plant pot, the detective decides to release Paul and others, and finally Paul can gather again with his family. From there, Paul tries to reform himself to love his family more, especially agreeing to his child's request not fight with Grace anymore. After getting his lesson, Paul announces that he wants to donate his impressive car at a gathering event and make that car a prize for the lucky person in an activity that is organized. After giving an opening speech, Paul approaches Grace to give a surprise, which turns out to be the uncle's necklace that has been repaired by Paul, and finally, the wife feels happy. The movie ends with Paul and his family, who go to Grace's uncle's siblings' house in a beautiful village, where Grace wants to fulfill the last request from the uncle, which is that his ashes be scattered in the lake, because the orphanage place that he used to donate to is in this village. So Grace does that with the view of the sun shining impressively. And finally, Paul and his family live happily. Make sure to subscribe and turn on notification so you don't miss the latest recaps.